A homeless 71-year-old veteran was sleeping outside a courthouse. What the judge did the next morning shocked everyone. The bench was hard, colder than it should have been for spring. Walt Mercer shifted under the army surplus blanket he'd folded into a makeshift sleeping bag. His boots, worn smooth on the soles, rested flat on the concrete, one laced tight, the other with the tongue flared open from a tear. He didn't mind. He'd slept in worse places, jungle mud, mountain caves, ship decks that shook under rocket fire. A courthouse bench? That was practically a hotel. He'd chosen this spot for a reason. Not because it was warm. It wasn't. Not because it was quiet. It never was. But because it meant something. The seal on the building's facade, chipped and faded, read, "Justice for All." It made him smile sometimes. Not bitterly. Just the kind of smile you give an old song that used to mean something. The first jogger passed around 5:40 a.m., female, earbuds in, eyes forward. She crossed to the opposite side of the steps without breaking stride. He didn't blame her. 30 years ago, he might have done the same. After her, a city worker with a leaf blower paused, squinted, then looked away. Walt nodded in return. Some folks only saw what they were told to see. By 6:15, the courthouse security rolled up in a marked sedan. 2 officers stepped out, coffee cups in hand, laughing about something. One saw him, the other kept laughing. "Still here," the first said, almost under his breath. Walt kept his hands visible, palms resting on his knees. Always open, always in calm. The taller guard leaned against the pillar and sipped his drink, eyeing Walt like he was deciding whether a stray dog was dangerous or just lost. "You know the shelter's down on Maple," the guard said eventually. Walt gave the smallest of nods. "Closed its doors 2 months ago. No beds left." The other guard frowned, quiet now. The air between them was thick with judgment. No one wanted to claim out loud. Walt returned his gaze to the horizon. Light was starting to slip between buildings. Soft, orange, turning the courthouse steps gold. He liked mornings. They were honest. No promises yet, just the truth of another day arriving. Inside the courthouse, people would start filing in soon. Lawyers with briefcases, mothers in worn sweaters, holding toddlers by the hand. Young men trying to look innocent, old men trying to look invisible. Walt had a reason for being there, but no one had asked yet. He wouldn't volunteer it, not until someone did. The taller guard tapped his partner. "Let's go open up." His voice dropped low. "Keep an eye on him. Might be casing the place." Walt heard them. Of course he did. But he didn't flinch, didn't argue. He'd learned long ago that sometimes silence was the loudest way to speak. He crossed his arms, adjusted the blanket, and waited. He wasn't going anywhere. Walt woke before the sun had a chance to show its face. The chill clung to his bones, like it had grown roots overnight. His shoulder ached the way it always did when he slept wrong, which lately was every night. He sat up slowly, careful not to jar the spot in his lower back that liked to remind him of a chopper crash in '73. His blanket was damp at the edges. Dew, maybe, or just time wearing through. He stood with a grunt, pressing one hand to the bench for balance. His knees didn't bend so much anymore as they negotiated. Each step was deliberate, a slow truce between pain and necessity. He tugged, his coat tighter around him, though the lining had long since given up its fight against the wind. Down 2 blocks and around a corner sat the church basement that opened its doors at 6 for coffee and stale bread. The line was already forming, men and women wrapped in layers of whatever they'd found or been given. No one talked much. There was comfort in the quiet. Stories too heavy for the cold didn't get told before coffee. Inside, the heater rattled but did its best. Walt took his tray, nodded at the tired volunteer behind the counter, and settled at a table by the wall. He didn't eat much, just enough to keep the engine running. A roll, some eggs if they weren't too watery. He tucked 2 sugar packets in his coat pocket a habit he'd picked up years ago and never dropped. The younger man across from him, maybe 30, watched him for a beat too long. "You ex-military?" the man asked. Walt didn't answer right away. He looked down at his boots, then out the window. "Used to be," he said. The man nodded like he understood, even if he didn't. When the plates were cleared and the doors opened back to the wind, Walt turned toward the courthouse. His limp was worse on the return trip, a deep, dragging kind that came from more than bad joints. But still, he walked. People bustled now. Suits, briefcases, car horns, a woman shouting into her phone. Walt walked unseen through the middle of it all, a ghost in broad daylight. He made it back to the courthouse steps just as the flag was being raised. He took off his hat, creased and faded and bearing the pin of a forgotten unit, and held it over his heart. No one else paused. But that didn't matter. Walt wasn't there by accident. He had business with this place, not the kind you wrote on a clipboard. Something older, deeper. He eased himself back down onto the bench, his breath fogging in front of him, and waited. Not for a handout, not for mercy, for a chance. Judge Eleanor Preston sipped her coffee, black, lukewarm, and as bitter as the stack of case files on her desk. The courthouse clock ticked past 7:30 a.m., and sunlight bled through the frosted windows, tracing pale lines across the cluttered mahogany. Mondays always dragged. Tuesdays argued back. She flipped open the docket, scanning names and charges with the practiced eyes of someone who'd seen it all and stopped being surprised by most of it. Disorderly conduct, vandalism, petty theft. Then one name caught her: Walter Mercer. Property theft, trespassing. No address, no attorney of record, no prior filings in her district. Her pen hovered. She frowned. It wasn't the charges that snagged her attention. It was the handwriting in the margin. A note from the arresting officer, elderly male, uncooperative, possibly delusional. Sleeping on courthouse steps. Claimed he had business here. Eleanor leaned back, the creak of her chair echoing in the quiet. She tapped the page with the edge of her pen. Mercer. Something about the name. It didn't feel new. Didn't feel like someone passing through. More like someone circling back. She reached for the intake form, read through it again. No ID at time of arrest. Mid-70s, estimated, refused shelter referral. No signs of intoxication, calm, but distant. When asked if he was seeking assistance, he reportedly said, "I've given my life to this country, thought maybe it could give me a moment." That stopped her cold. Eleanor had heard every excuse under the sun, but that didn't sound like an excuse. It sounded like a statement someone made when they were done asking nicely. She rose from her desk and walked to the small window that overlooked the front steps. The bench was empty now, freshly wiped by the janitor's morning mop. But she pictured him there anyway, a man wrapped in layers, not for style but survival, sitting on the edge of the world with nothing but time and silence. She returned to her desk and flipped to the file again. There was something here, something just under the surface. Not a criminal, not really, more like a thread someone had dropped a long time ago and never bothered to pick back up. Eleanor didn't like loose threads. She circled the name with her pen, underlined it once, then again. "Walter Mercer," she said aloud, testing the weight of it, the sound of a man who'd lived through too much and come too far to be written off with a citation. She made a note in the margin, "Hold for review." "I want to see him myself." Some cases demanded more than protocol. This felt like one of them. Outside, the flag climbed slowly up its pole, tugged by a breeze no one else seemed to notice. Inside, the judge kept reading, but her mind stayed on the name. 2 nights earlier, the courthouse was quiet. No gavel strikes, no murmured pleas, no chatter of clerks pushing carts of files, just the soft hum of a nearby street lamp, flickering slightly as moths circled its glow. Walt sat on the top step, wrapped in his blanket like a man anchored to something older than concrete. His hat rested in his lap. The building loomed behind him, silent and shut. He wasn't asleep. Not really. He didn't trust the dark enough for that. He just sat still, watching the shadows stretch across the sidewalk like fingers. The cruiser rolled up slow, headlights cutting across the plaza like searchlights. 2 officers stepped out, young and clipped in movement. One adjusted his belt, the other unsnapped the flashlight holster with a practiced flick. "You can't be here," the first one said, voice not unkind, just tired. Walt said nothing. "You hear me, sir?" He nodded. "I hear you." The flashlight clicked on, beam dancing across the blanket, the boots, the sunken lines in his face. "Name?" the second officer asked. Walt looked up. "No trouble here." "That's not a name." The 2 exchanged a look. One took a step forward, the other radioed in. Walt didn't move. "You're trespassing after hours on government property," the first officer explained. "You need to provide ID." "I'm not hiding," Walt said. "I just didn't want to sleep under the overpass again." The second officer's voice crackled over the radio. "No match, not in the local system." "Sir, you're required to identify yourself." Walt stared past them. Not defiant, not scared, just steady. "I'm not giving you trouble, I'm just tired." "You're refusing to identify." "I'm not refusing, I just don't see the point." They cuffed him gently but firmly. He didn't resist, didn't argue, just winced when his shoulder was pulled too far back. The younger officer noticed, said nothing. They walked him down the steps he'd climbed that morning, the same ones he'd planned to sit on again the next day. At the station, they asked again. Name, date of birth, background. He looked at the intake officer with clear eyes. "Walt," he said simply. "Walt what?" "Just Walt." The intake officer sighed, marked him as John Doe pending ID. In the holding cell, Walt sat on the farthest bench, back to the wall. He closed his eyes, but sleep didn't come, not yet. The other men talked, nervous laughter, loud bravado, whispered worry. Walt stayed quiet, not because he had nothing to say, but because, after a lifetime of knowing when to speak and when not to, silence had become his sharpest tool. He folded his hands in his lap and waited. Officer Ramirez leaned against the open door of the breakroom fridge, debating whether the off-brand yogurt had finally turned. He sniffed, winced, and tossed it in the trash. The station smelled like cheap coffee, old paperwork, and the faint sting of disinfectant that never quite covered the sweat in the air. "Hey," he said, turning to his partner across the room. "That guy we picked up the other night, the one sleeping on the courthouse steps. You see his arm?" Officer Daniels didn't look up from his paperwork. "The old guy. What about it?" Ramirez grabbed a chair and dropped into it with a tired grunt. "Tattoo, left forearm, faded to hell, but it wasn't the usual barbed wire or skull. Looked military. Some kind of emblem I've never seen." Daniels shrugged. "Lot of old vets on the street. Doesn't mean much." "No," Ramirez said, rubbing the back of his neck. It wasn't just the ink. He had this stillness, you know, like the room moved around him, not the other way. Daniels raised an eyebrow, finally looking up. "You get poetic all of a sudden." "I'm serious, man. We've had plenty of drunks, plenty of angry guys, sad cases. This one, I don't know." He didn't flinch. "Even when we cuffed him. Didn't say a word the whole ride in." "Exactly," Ramirez nodded. "Not scared, not confused, just quiet, like someone who's waited in darker places than our back seat." Daniels shook his head and went back to writing. "You're too young to be this dramatic." Ramirez leaned back, eyes on the ceiling now. He had scars, too. Deep ones. Old, shoulder, right side. Maybe shrapnel. "Looked like someone stitched him up in a jungle with dental floss." Daniels snorted. "You think we arrested Rambo? I think we picked up someone who's been through more than either of us can imagine, and we treated him like he was loitering at a mall." Silence settled between them for a moment. Outside the room, a phone rang. A fax machine sputtered. Somewhere down the hall, a door slammed. Ramirez leaned forward again. He said something. You know, not much, but... I remember it. Daniels didn't look up. Yeah, Ramirez lowered his voice. Said he didn't want trouble. Said he was tired of being forgotten. Daniels paused, pen midair. Forgotten, he echoed. Yeah, Ramirez looked down at his hands. That word stuck with me. For a long moment, neither of them said anything. Outside, the city moved on without noticing that one of its quietest soldiers had just passed through again, this time in cuffs instead of boots. The holding cell stank of old sweat, dried spit, and fear too proud to say its name. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a pale, flickering wash over the concrete floor, and steel benches bolted to the wall. Walt sat near the corner, his back straight, legs planted firm, hands resting loosely in his lap. He looked like someone waiting for a train that was late but inevitable. His eyes were half shut, but never fully closed. A soldier's rest. He breathed slow and deep, unmoved by the noises around him, snoring, muttering, the clank of boots echoing from the hallway. He'd learned long ago that calm was a kind of armor, and he wore it well. A wiry man paced the cell, early 30s, thin in the way anger eats muscle. He'd been muttering to himself for 20 minutes, building steam, tattoos on his knuckles, scars on his temple, trouble looking for a spark. When his shoe scuffed too close to Walt, he stopped. Looked down. You deaf or just too good to look at someone when they walk past? The man asked, his voice pitched high with whatever cocktail had been in his veins before the arrest. Walt didn't answer, didn't even blink. Old man thinks he's better than the rest of us, the guy muttered, loud enough for the other detainees to hear. No one responded, no one wanted in. He stepped closer. I said, you ignoring me? Walt raised his eyes, then, slow, steady. Nothing in his face suggested fear or challenge, just an alertness, honed sharper than any blade. The younger man faltered. His breath caught for a second, like he'd just remembered something from a long time ago. A father's belt, a sergeant's shout, a time someone looked at him like that and it hadn't ended well. Walt tilted his head, just slightly, and spoke. You don't want to do this. His voice was soft, like wind brushing dry leaves across a porch. It wasn't a threat. It was a statement, a truth spoken from somewhere deeper than the floor they stood on. The man stood frozen for a heartbeat too long, then scoffed and turned away, barking something about crazy old vets. He didn't pace again. Sat down across the cell, rubbing his jaw with the heel of his hand. Walt lowered his gaze, the moment already behind him. He shifted his weight, careful with the knee that never healed right. Let his head rest back against the wall. Sleep didn't come easy. It hadn't in decades. But still he sat there, still and silent, eyes half-lidded, listening for footsteps, for keys turning in locks, for whatever came next. He'd been in worse cells, in worse company, but never once had he stopped choosing how to carry himself. The courtroom was half empty, echoing with the rustle of papers and the low murmur of lawyers checking their notes. The bailiff opened the side door, and 2 deputies escorted Walt in. No chains, just his hands folded loosely in front of him, the same way a man might hold his hat at a funeral. He walked with a measured limp, each step deliberate. His coat was too thin for the weather, sleeves fraying at the cuffs. The courtroom didn't stir, didn't lean in, but a few eyes lingered on him a beat longer than usual, not because he looked dangerous, because he looked like someone who didn't belong there and yet carried the place like a burden he'd known before. Judge Eleanor Preston glanced up from the case file. She saw the name, the date of birth, 71 years old, arrested for trespassing and suspected theft, though nothing had actually been stolen, just a blanket and a plastic bag on the courthouse steps. Mr. Mercer, she said, voice clear but even, do you understand the charges against you? Walt looked up at her, eyes steady. Yes, ma'am. She waited for more. He offered none. You were found sleeping outside this courthouse after hours. When approached by officers, you did not provide identification. I had none, he replied. His voice was calm, not defiant, not meek, just plain spoken. You also did not give your full name. Would you like to now? He hesitated, not from fear, but choice. Then, Walter Mercer. She leaned slightly forward. Why here? Why this courthouse? Walt looked around slowly, taking in the walls, the flags, the people scribbling on pads. Then back to her. I came for help. That stopped her. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was the kind of answer that didn't ask for sympathy. It asked for attention. What kind of help? He didn't answer right away, just shifted his stance to ease pressure off one knee. Something that should have come a long time ago, he said. I figured maybe the courthouse was where people went when they couldn't find answers anywhere else. The room quieted. A few attorneys looked up now, sensing something different. Judge Preston studied him. There was no slouch in his spine, no twitch in his hands, no plea in his voice. Just a man standing where he wasn't expected, telling the truth no one had made time to hear. She set the file down gently. All right, Mr. Mercer, she said. We'll start from there. And for the first time in a very long while, Walt Mercer exhaled like something heavy had shifted, just slightly, off his shoulders. Judge Preston waited until Walt had been escorted out, quietly, without cuffs, before she reached for the docket again. Her hand hovered over the file. She wasn't finished with him, not by a long shot. She tapped her pen once, then twice, before finally scribbling a note in the margin. Expedite full background check. Military inquiry. Possible VA records. The clerk looked up from his desk across the room. He squinted at her writing, then at her face. You want that run federal? He asked, voice low. For a trespassing case. Preston didn't look up. Yes. The clerk blinked. Ma'am? That's... I'm aware, she said. Sharper now. Do it. He nodded slowly and turned back to his computer, fingers hesitating a moment before typing. Across the courtroom, a young public defender leaned over to his colleague. Since when does a judge care this much about a guy caught sleeping outside? He whispered. The other shrugged. Maybe she knows him. I doubt it. You see the look she gave him? Like he was someone worth knowing. They both fell quiet. Judge Preston sat still for a moment, the way someone does when their instincts are louder than their reason. There'd been something in the way Walt had stood there, not defensive, not desperate, just present. He'd spoken plainly, but with a precision she recognized, like every word had been chosen carefully, not because he was afraid of saying too much, but because he'd already said too much to too many people in a lifetime. And that line, I came for help, it wasn't a plea, it was a reminder. She pulled the file closer again. No criminal history, no prior court appearances. No address, just a man who seemed to materialize one day on the courthouse steps, quiet as snow. Military inquiry, the clerk asked again from behind his monitor, cautiously. Start there, Preston said, and flag it confidential. I want the report sent directly to Chambers. Yes, Your Honor. As the courtroom reset for the next case, she sat back and looked out over the polished wood and the seal mounted above her bench. The same seal that had been there since her father's days behind the gavel. She couldn't shake the feeling that the man who had stood before her wasn't a vagrant or a drifter. He was something else, something forgotten. And Judge Eleanor Preston had never been one to let a story go untold, especially not when the world had already stopped listening. The report came in just after 6 a.m., slid quietly into Judge Preston's encrypted inbox with a dull chime. The courthouse was still dark, the only light in her office spilling from a green-shaded desk lamp and the glow of her screen. She sat back in her chair, black coffee cooling beside a stack of unopened case files, and clicked. Subject: Mercer, Walter J. Dobbie, April 14, 1952, Service Branch, United States Army. Rank at discharge: Sergeant Major, E9. Commendations: Silver Star, Bronze Star, with V device, 2 oak leaf clusters, Purple Heart, 2, Army Commendation Medal. Airborne qualification: Pathfinder, Special Forces, Active Tours, Vietnam, Gulf War, Classified Deployments, Redacted, Last recorded assignment, 3rd Special Forces Group, Fort Bragg, discharged, May 1994. Notes: Administrative discharge under Article 15-6 review. Final adjudication sealed. No current VA benefits on file. Last known address, unknown. Preston stared at the screen for a long while, reading each line twice, then again. Her breath caught somewhere between disbelief and something more private, something closer to shame. A man with that kind of record didn't end up sleeping on courthouse steps by coincidence. He'd been erased, not forgotten. She leaned forward and clicked into the redacted section. Access denied. Clearance required. Even as a judge, there were doors she couldn't open. She scrolled back up. Silver Star, Bronze Star. Those weren't medals you handed out at a desk. They were earned in fire and dust, when the stakes were life, and the witnesses didn't always live to testify. Yet there it was. Final line. No current VA benefits on file. No disability. No pension. No health care. It was as if he'd slipped through a crack that no one ever bothered to seal. Or maybe, she considered, he'd jumped. She printed the report, each page feeding out of the old office printer with a mechanical stutter. When the last sheet landed, she ran a hand over it like it might vanish if left too long untouched. Sergeant Major Walter J. Mercer. She whispered the name aloud, hearing the weight it carried now. 3 tours, decorations most soldiers never dreamed of, and then silence. Since 1994, not a whisper in the system. She reached into the bottom drawer of her desk and pulled out a leather folder, her father's. Inside were faded notes, old case summaries from his days on the bench. One name, jotted in the corner of a yellowed memo from 1983, caught her eye. Mercer, training consultant, Fort Bragg, quiet as a shadow, smarter than most generals. The air in the office felt heavier. She picked up the phone, dialed her clerk. "Push my morning docket back an hour," she said. "Everything okay, Judge?" She looked down at the file. "No," she said. "But it will be." The courthouse cafeteria was quiet at that hour, save for the soft clink of silverware and the low hiss of the old espresso machine. Judge Eleanor Preston sat alone at a corner table, the file on Walter Mercer spread out before her like the pieces of a puzzle someone had deliberately thrown away. She stirred her coffee absently, eyes fixed on the report's final pages. No VA records, no service-connected benefits, no mailing address, no medical file. No contact with Veterans Affairs since 1994. It was as if a man with 3 combat tours and enough decorations to fill a wall had vanished the moment he walked off base. She leaned back, letting the absurdity of it wash over her. Men like Mercer didn't disappear. They were supposed to retire into quiet dignity, flag-draped ceremonies, folded letters from presidents, not end up sleeping under the carved granite promise of justice for all. She picked up the phone and dialed the regional VA office. "Good morning. This is Judge Eleanor Preston, 9th District. I'm calling about a veteran, Sergeant Major Walter Mercer. Silver Star, 3 tours, discharged in 94. I need his benefit history." The woman on the other end paused, clicked keys. "I'm sorry, ma'am. We don't have anyone active by that name. Could be a clerical error or a lapse in re-enrollment. He's not receiving anything. Not even medical." "No, ma'am, nothing in the system." Eleanor closed her eyes for a moment. "Thank you," she said, then hung up. She sat there, staring at the folder, jaw clenched tight. She'd seen bureaucratic failures before, files lost, applications denied, appeals buried under red tape. But this was something else. A void. A blank space where a life should have continued. She flipped back to the discharge notes. Administrative separation under Article 15-6. Final adjudication sealed. The language was vague, intentionally so. Someone had pushed him out the back door and locked it behind him. Whatever had happened in 1994, it hadn't just ended his career. It had erased his name from every system designed to protect the men who gave everything. And yet, he hadn't disappeared into bitterness. He hadn't raged in court or demanded attention. He had shown up, silent, and asked for help with a calm that unnerved her more than any outburst could have. She ran a finger across the faded ink on the memo from her father's old folder. Quiet as a shadow. Smarter than most generals. A man like that didn't fall through the cracks. He was pushed. Eleanor closed the file and stood, her coffee untouched. She didn't know what had happened to Walter Mercer in 1994, but she was going to find out. Because if the system could forget him, it could forget anyone, and she wasn't about to let that happen on her watch. The old house on Sycamore Lane still smelled faintly of pipe tobacco and old books, even though Judge Preston's father hadn't smoked in years. The porch creaked under her heels, the same way it always had when she came home, like the boards were announcing her arrival before she even knocked. She found him in the den, sitting in his favorite chair with the TV muted, a baseball game flickering soundlessly on the screen. A quilt folded neatly over his knees. A half-finished crossword balanced on the armrest. "Ellie," he said, not looking up. "It's not Sunday." She smiled faintly and stepped in. "I know. I need to ask you something." He turned toward her then, sharp eyes that had seen too much for one lifetime narrowing with curiosity. Court-related or family gossip? Both, maybe. She held out the manila folder. He took it with steady hands, slipped the pages out, and adjusted his reading glasses. A silence settled as he scanned the first sheet, then the second. His jaw set slowly, like a hinge stiff with age. "Walter Mercer," he murmured, the name breaking the stillness like a stone dropped in still water. "So you do know him?" she asked, already knowing the answer. He didn't respond right away. Instead, he stood, slow but without help, and crossed the room to a shelf lined with framed photographs. He picked one out from the corner, dusted it with his sleeve, and handed it to her. 6 young men in camo, crouched in front of a chopper, mud-smeared, grinning, alive. She recognized one face immediately, her Uncle Jake, barely 20, all teeth and tan. Another man stood slightly apart, not smiling, watchful. Walt Mercer. "Firebase Ripcord, 71, her father said softly. "The day after the ambush." He lowered himself back into the chair, the memory sitting heavier than the years on his shoulders. Mercer was with Special Forces. Quiet, strange quiet, the kind that made young guys nervous. But God, he was sharp. He saw things before they happened. That day, Jake's team got pinned down on the wrong side of a ridge. Mercer wasn't even assigned to them, but he went anyway. Pulled them out one by one under fire. Eleanor looked back at the photo, the faces frozen in a moment she suddenly felt part of. "Why haven't I heard about him before?" she asked. Her father let out a long breath. "Because that's how he wanted it. Never wanted credit, never talked about medals, said war should be remembered, not celebrated." And after, he disappeared. Word was, he took a fall for someone higher up, refused to defend himself. That's what the good ones do sometimes. They protect the people who wouldn't survive the truth. Eleanor sat in silence, the weight of it all pressing down. "He saved 6 men that day," her father said, voice rough, "including your uncle. You wouldn't be here if not for Walter Mercer." And suddenly, the name in the folder wasn't just a case. It was a debt. The afternoon session was quiet. the courtroom half empty again. Judge Preston sat a little straighter than usual, the weight of history riding the edge of her shoulders. Walt Mercer's file was in front of her, closed now, but not forgotten, never again forgotten. The bailiff called his name, and Walt entered through the side door, not in shackles, not flanked by deputies, just escorted by one officer who kept his distance. Walt moved like a man who didn't expect much anymore. He didn't look around the room, didn't scan for sympathy, just stepped forward with that same measured pace, like he knew exactly where to stop and how to stand. Eleanor folded her hands. "Mr. Mercer," she said, her tone even but softer than the morning had heard it. "Your background has been reviewed. I've read it thoroughly. I've also spoken with several individuals, including former service members who knew you." Walt said nothing, but she caught the flicker in his eyes. Not surprise, just recognition that someone, finally, had looked. She continued, "Given the unusual nature of your case and your history of distinguished service, I am exercising discretion under state judicial authority. I am ordering that you be remanded not to county jail, but to court-supervised custody." A quiet rustle moved through the courtroom. The clerk paused mid-keystroke. One of the public defenders sat up straighter. Walt tilted his head slightly. "Court custody?" he asked, voice low. Eleanor nodded. "The courthouse has a jury deliberation room that's no longer in use. It has a door, a bed, and heat. You'll stay there for 72 hours while a full evaluation is conducted. And after that, we'll take the next step together," she said simply. "One step at a time." Walt stood there a moment longer. He looked past her, to the old wooden seal behind her bench, then back at her. "Thank you, Your Honor," he said, voice steady but touched with something that sounded like breath returning to tired lungs. The bailiff stepped forward, hesitant. Walt didn't flinch, didn't question. He turned and walked out calmly, without looking back. When the door closed behind him, Eleanor let out a slow breath and looked at the clerk. "Make a note," she said. "Room 3B to be prepped with bedding and access to meals. Contact maintenance for a space heater." The clerk blinked. "Ma'am, are we even allowed?" "We are now." Later that night, while the city moved on without knowing what had passed, a light stayed on in the old jury room. Walt sat on the edge of the narrow bed, blanket folded neatly beside him, staring at the walls that had once heard the voices of people deciding justice. Now they held the silence of a man who had waited decades for someone to say, "You don't belong in a cell. You belong in a story that was never finished." The knock on the door came just past 7. Walt was sitting in the corner of the jury room, elbows on his knees, staring at a faded scuff on the tile floor. He hadn't asked what time it was, didn't need to. A soldier's body keeps its own clock long after the world stops asking it to. The door creaked open, and a woman stepped in, a bailiff, maybe late 30s, uniform crisp, ponytail tucked tight. She held a tray with both hands like it mattered. "Evening, Mr. Mercer," she said. "Got you something warm." Walt stood slowly, back straightening with a quiet groan. He moved like a man built from equal parts wear and resolve. The tray was set on the small table someone had dragged in earlier, folding legs, scratched top, but a place to eat. Beef stew, 2 rolls, mashed potatoes with a square of butter melting in the middle. Not prison food, not charity leftovers, real food. The kind made in a kitchen where someone tasted it before serving. The woman stood for a moment, unsure if she should stay. Walt looked at the tray, then up at her, eyes clear and sharp despite the years. "Thank you, ma'am," he said, voice quiet as a breath, but wrapped in something deeper, dignity maybe, or a kind of reverence that hadn't dulled over time. She paused. Not because he was loud or demanding, but because he meant it. "You're welcome, Mr. Mercer," she said. "If you need anything, knock, I'll be just down the hall." He nodded once. She left without another word. Walt sat, picked up the spoon with a hand that still bore a ridge of callus on the inside of his thumb. He ate slow, each bite a memory. He hadn't had a meal like that he couldn't even say, not just hot food, but served with care. No line, no shouting, no suspicion. He took one roll and tucked it in the napkin for later, a habit he couldn't shake. The room was quiet except for the soft clink of the spoon against the bowl. Outside, the courthouse settled into its usual nighttime hush. Papers filed, lights dimmed, voices gone. But in room 3B, something stirred. A stillness not born from silence, but from something being returned. Not rights, not glory, just regard. Walt finished the last bite and wiped his mouth with the edge of the napkin. Then, like it was a ritual, he placed the spoon carefully across the empty bowl and sat back in the chair. For the first time in years, the ache in his stomach wasn't hunger, and for the first time in longer, someone had fed him not because he needed it, but because they thought he deserved it. The courthouse was quiet again, long after the suits had gone home and the lights had dimmed to their low, buzzing glow. It was the kind of stillness that gave echoes room to stretch their legs. Down the hall, Leon, the night janitor, pushed his mop bucket past the second-floor gallery and into the main lobby. That's where he saw it. A plain, weathered folder, left sitting on the bench by the west wall. Walt's bench. Leon paused, leaning on the mop. He'd seen the old man sit there day after day, never asking for anything, never making a mess, just waiting. He picked it up carefully. The paper was soft with age, edges curled, no name on the outside. Just a crease from having been folded and unfolded too many times. Leon didn't open it, didn't feel like it was his to open, but he knew where it should go. 20 minutes later, it sat on Judge Preston's desk, left with a note that read, "Found on the bench." Figured it mattered. She saw it first thing the next morning before coffee, before her clerk arrived. The folder had weight, not from paper, but from time. She opened it slowly. Inside were photographs, each worn soft like river stones, black and white snapshots of young men in jungle gear, helmets tipped back, grins wide despite the sweat. One showed a chopper hovering over a ridgeline, another a squad crouched around a campfire, eyes alert even in rest. Then came the letters, commendations typed on yellowing government stationery. One bore the signature of a general she recognized, another carried a single word scrawled at the bottom in fading ink, "Ode." She kept turning pages until her hand froze. It was a photo, creased down the center, edges frayed. A boy, maybe 9 or 10, standing in front of a picket fence, smiling, gap-toothed, baseball glove on one hand and a flag folded neatly under the other arm. On the back, in tight handwriting, Jacob, 1985. Before the hospital. She stared at that name longer than she meant to. There were more papers, a map with hand-drawn markings, a typed recommendation for advancement never signed, a letter from a VA office stamped "Returned, address unknown," a birthday card, unsent, the message inside blank. The folder wasn't organized, it wasn't curated, it was a life stacked in pieces. Judge Preston leaned back, folder open in front of her, a silence settling around the room like dust in morning light. This wasn't evidence, this was proof. Proof of a man who had lived, served, lost and kept going, and somewhere along the way had been misplaced by the very system that owed him everything. She closed the folder gently, like it might shatter. Then she picked up the phone. Judge Preston had long learned that authority didn't mean access, not in systems built to forget their own. She sat at her office desk, sleeves rolled to her elbows, coffee gone cold beside a legal pad filled with names, numbers, and the slow unraveling of a man's life. Walt Mercer's folder lay open nearby, its contents spread like puzzle pieces with no box to guide the shape. She had already called the VA twice. First, she was transferred 6 times. The second time, they simply told her, "There's nothing here, Judge. He doesn't exist in our active files." "Maybe he never enrolled." "But he did serve," she said evenly. "We don't have a record of that." "You're wrong," she replied, and hung up. She tried the Department of Defense next. Hit a wall so thick and polished it might as well have been marble. Phrases like "not within public inquiry scope" and "classified record structures" bounced back at her like a game of bureaucratic tennis. She even tried her father's old army contacts. Most were gone, some couldn't help, and one said, "Walt Mercer. That man disappeared for a reason. Don't stir ghosts." But she wasn't stirring ghosts. She was finding the living. On a hunch, she dialed a number from one of the old letters in Walt's folder, a recommendation form from 1988, signed Col Everett Maynard. It was a long shot. People moved. People died. People forgot. A click, a pause, then a voice answered. "Maynard." She straightened. "Colonel Maynard, this is Judge Eleanor Preston, 9th District Court." Another pause. "You're Charles Preston's daughter." She blinked. "Yes. I didn't know you knew my father." I read his retirement statement. Called him a blunt instrument with a sharp mind. A dry chuckle. "That was a compliment." She allowed herself the faintest smile. "I'm calling about a former soldier, Walter Mercer." The line went silent. She waited. When Maynard spoke, his voice was low, but not tired. Reverent. Mercer was the kind of man you only meet once. Saved lives the Army never even officially knew were at risk. Trained my recon teams personally in '86. What's this about? She told him. Everything. The bench, the charges, the file with gaps bigger than truths. The system that had no memory of him. The colonel exhaled slowly. They erased him. Not because he failed, because he wouldn't play the game. Took the heat for a superior's mistake, walked away quietly before the machine could grind him up. "He's living on Courthouse steps," she said, "and I can't get past the red tape." "You don't need permission," Maynard said. "You just need someone who remembers." She heard papers rustle on his end, the scrape of an old filing cabinet. "Give me 24 hours. I'll find what the records won't tell you." "Thank you, Colonel." "No, Judge. Thank him. We've been standing too long on his shoulders to forget whose they are." She hung up and looked at the folder again. This time, it didn't feel so heavy. The call came just after dawn, just as the courthouse janitor was unlocking the front doors. Judge Preston answered on the first ring, her voice still rough from sleep, though her mind had been awake half the night, turning over every word in Walt's file. "Preston," she said. "Maynard," came the reply. "You got a minute?" She reached for the recorder on her desk, but stopped. This wasn't for the record. This was for the truth. "I've got all the time you need." There was a long breath on the other end. Then, "I first met Walt Mercer at Fort Harrison, 1985. Cold winter. We were running mountain survival drills, trying to break in a new group of officers who thought maps were more useful than instinct. Mercer showed up in a patched-up parka. Didn't say much. But those men followed him after 2 days, like he was Moses." "What was his role?" Eleanor asked. "Officially, training consultant. Unofficially, the guy you sent when things got too complicated for protocol. Walt had a gift, read terrain like scripture, read people better." Maynard paused. "But he made enemies, the kind that wear stars and don't like being told they're wrong. In '94, Walt was part of a black flag recon op that went south. Not his fault. Command ordered a team in too deep, too fast. Walt pulled most of them out, should have gotten a second Silver Star. What happened instead? They court-martialed him," Maynard said, bitter, "accused him of insubordination and misreporting mission intel. It was nonsense. Everyone in the know knew it. He wouldn't name names, wouldn't drag down the men above him. Said if he had to fall for it, he'd rather fall clean. And the verdict? Guilty. Dishonorable discharge. No benefits, no pension. He disappeared after that. But the conviction was overturned." "Yeah," Maynard said. 6 months later, Quietly, classified review, a paper reversal, too late to make the papers. By then he was already gone. Eleanor's voice lowered. "Why didn't you go after him? Bring him back." "I tried," Maynard said. "God knows I tried. But you don't chase shadows, especially not ones that want to stay hidden." Walt lived by one rule: protect the people, even if the people don't remember to protect you back. Silence stretched across the line like a bridge over too many years. "Judge," he said, voice softer now, "if he came to your courthouse, he didn't come by accident. Walt never goes anywhere without purpose." "I know," she said. "Then don't waste time trying to save him," Maynard said. "He doesn't need saving." She didn't speak. "Just make sure he's seen." The line went dead. Eleanor sat there, file open, sunlight creeping across the wood grain of her desk. Somewhere down the hall, footsteps echoed. Life was returning to the courthouse. But now she knew. Walt hadn't fallen through the cracks. He had been buried in them. The jury room was quiet that evening, lit only by the soft amber of a desk lamp someone had left for him. Walt sat near the window, the chair creaking softly beneath him, the silence more comfortable than most beds he'd known. He wasn't waiting for anything. Waiting implied someone owed him something. But the knock on the door came anyway. Judge Preston stepped inside, holding a file, not official, not the kind with seals and stamps, just a manila folder, worn at the corners, filled with something close to truth. "I spoke to Colonel Maynard," she said gently. "He told me what happened in '94. Walt didn't look surprised. He just watched her, as if listening to a weather report he'd already felt in his bones. "Court-martial. Recon op gone wrong," she continued. "He said you refused to name the officer who gave the bad order." Walt leaned back slightly. "He was 22, he said, voice quiet. "First command. Bright kid. Had a future if they let him keep it." "You took the fall," she said. He shrugged like it didn't matter. "Didn't feel like a fall. Felt like the job. We all swore to protect something. Sometimes that means swallowing the bullet so someone else doesn't have to." "You were exonerated," she said. "After the fact. They cleared your name." "On paper," Walt nodded. "But paper doesn't get you back what you already gave away." She stepped farther into the room, setting the folder on the table beside his uneaten dinner. "Why didn't you come back into the system? Apply for benefits? Reinstate your record?" Walt was quiet for a long time. Then, "Because I didn't want what came with it, the press release, the ceremony, a folded flag and a promise too late to help anyone that mattered. You could have had a pension. I didn't need money. You could have had care. I didn't want pity." Her voice softened. "You deserve dignity." Walt looked at her then, something behind his eyes sharper than grief, duller than anger. "Dignity isn't a medal, Judge. It's how you live when no one's watching." She nodded, understanding now that this wasn't a story of injustice. It was a story of quiet choices, made for others, never reclaimed. "I came here," Walt said, "because I thought maybe someone would look close enough to see I was still standing." "You were more than standing," she said. "You were holding up the part of the system everyone forgot." He gave her a small, tired smile. "I just did my job." She looked down at the folder, then back at the man who had once trained soldiers to move through darkness without leaving a trace. "Then maybe it's time someone did theirs," she said. And for the first time since she'd met him, Walt Mercer nodded. Not as a soldier, not as a man owed something, but as a witness to a truth finally seen. The courthouse echoed differently at night. Without footsteps, without the shuffle of paper and law books, it felt more like a church than a place of judgment. Judge Preston found herself walking its hallways not as an official, but as someone searching for the last pieces of a story she hadn't known she'd needed to hear. She stopped outside the old jury room. The door was slightly ajar, warm light spilling onto the marble floor like a quiet invitation. She knocked once, gently. "Come in," came Walt's voice, steady, even. She stepped inside to find him sitting at the small table, a cup of tea in front of him, untouched. The folder she'd returned was open again, and beside it lay the worn photograph of the boy, creased, softened at the corners, but carefully laid out like something sacred. "You can sit," he said, without looking up. She did. The chair across from him groaned softly as she settled in. They sat in silence for a while. Not awkward, just still, like the space between them had to make room for what hadn't yet been said. "His name was Jacob," Walt said finally, nodding toward the photo. "Born in 75. Smart kid. Thought Legos were beneath him by the time he was 5. Eleanor smiled, just barely. "His mother passed when he was 7, Walt went on. "Drunk driver. Early morning. I was on a base in Germany. Took 3 days to get back. By then, he'd already stopped asking where I was." He traced the edge of the photo with one calloused finger. "They found the leukemia a year later, just a routine checkup. Then everything changed. He started treatment. I tried to stay stateside, but, well, orders are orders." "You weren't there when he passed," she said gently. Walt didn't answer right away. His jaw shifted, slow and deliberate. "I was on a flight home, 42 hours too late. He was 10. She looked at him then, not as a judge, but as a daughter who had grown up in the shadow of uniforms and folded flags. "I carried a photo of him in my chest pocket for every op after that," Walt said. "Didn't believe in luck, but I believed in memory. Memory keeps you sharper than fear ever could." The photo trembled slightly as he slid it back into the folder. "Funny thing is," he said, "I spent most of my life following orders to protect people I'd never meet. But I couldn't save the one who needed me most." Eleanor reached out, gently placed her hand over his for a moment. No speech, no platitudes, just presence. "You saved more than you know," she said softly. Walt nodded once, eyes still on the folder. "I just didn't expect to still be here when someone finally asked why I was sitting on those courthouse steps." "You're not just here," she said. "You're finally being seen." And in the quiet that followed, Walt looked at peace for the first time. Judge Eleanor Preston hadn't written a motion like this before, not in 2 decades on the bench. It wasn't legalese or boilerplate language pulled from old files. This one came from somewhere older than policy, somewhere closer to the bone. She sat at her desk in the early hours, Courthouse still cloaked in dawn's silence, typing each word with the care of someone threading a needle in a dim room. The emergency petition wasn't just for benefits or records correction or reinstatement of honor. It was for recognition. A formal demand to the state governor and the Department of Veterans Affairs to restore what had been stolen, not just from Walter Mercer, but from every quiet hero the system had chosen to forget. The file she attached read like a case study in institutional failure. Court-martial transcripts sealed without cause, reversal orders buried, VA filings returned to sender. Her language was precise, her tone unwavering. Sergeant Major Walter J., Mercer Silver Star recipient and decorated veteran of 3 tours, was wrongfully discharged following a flawed military tribunal. His record was cleared, but the correction came too late to repair the damage done. For 30 years, he has lived without recognition, support or care, not by choice, but by abandonment. The time for silence has passed. The state owes him more than an apology. It owes him restoration. She signed it, pressed send, and exhaled slowly. 3 days later, she opened her courtroom to the public, not for a trial, but a hearing. The benches were full before the hour struck. Word had spread like wind through dry grass. Veterans in uniform lined the back row. Local officials sat stiff in their suits. Students, old neighbors, even courthouse staff off duty came to listen. Walt was seated at the defense table, wearing the same coat but with a fresh shave and a quiet dignity that filled the room. He said nothing. He didn't need to. Eleanor cleared her throat and began, "This hearing is not about guilt or innocence. It is about acknowledgement, about setting the record straight, not for the court's satisfaction, but for the truths." She read from the petition, then from the letters of support that had poured in after Walt's story reached the community, one from a medic he'd saved in '91, another from the widow of a man whose name appeared in Walt's notebook, marked with a star. And then she looked out over the room, voice steady. "Justice is not a luxury. It is not a favor we grant to those who ask politely. It is a duty. And today, this court acknowledges that duty has gone unmet." No one clapped. No one needed to. The silence was fuller than applause, the kind of silence that felt like a promise kept. The first reporter showed up with a handheld camera and a notebook that had seen better days. She stood at the courthouse steps as the sun was just beginning to rise, her breath curling in the morning air. The headline she read into the camera was simple, but it carried like thunder. "Veteran found sleeping outside the system he served." By noon, there were vans parked up and down the street, antennae stretching skyward like nervous fingers. The town hadn't seen this kind of attention since the governor came through for a campaign stop 5 years back. But this wasn't politics, this was something heavier, quieter, the kind of story that didn't need to shout to be heard. The courtroom filled faster than expected. Veterans arrived first, not just the ones from town, but from the neighboring counties too. They wore faded jackets with patches and pins, hats that bore years, not slogans. Some limped, some walked tall, but all came for one reason: Walt. The pews packed with men and women who had served and survived. Then came the civilians, shopkeepers, teachers, the barber from Maple Street, the nurse who once treated Walt at the free clinic, not knowing who he was. A high school history teacher cancelled class and brought a dozen students who had never heard of Firebase Ripcord or the 3rd Special Forces Group, but were about to learn what quiet valor looked like. Walt sat near the front again, flanked by 2 empty chairs on either side. His request: he didn't want attention. He wanted space, not to be a part, but to remind people that some men carry stories too heavy to sit shoulder to shoulder with strangers. Judge Preston entered from chambers, and the room rose, not just out of routine, but respect. The air had changed, thickened. The silence wasn't awkward, it was reverent. Even the kids in the back stopped whispering. She looked out over the crowd and found herself caught, just for a moment, by the gravity of it. Not her courtroom. Not today. This belonged to something older than the law. A journalist in the back whispered to her colleague, "He's the real deal, huh?" The reply came without hesitation. "He's the story we forgot to tell." Outside, more people stood by the courthouse steps, watching the hearing stream on a mounted screen someone had wheeled out from the city council building. No one shouted. No one chanted. They just stood, some with hands in pockets, some holding small flags, some with tears they weren't quite sure how to explain. In a world that often rewarded volume, Walter Mercer had spoken in silence. And now, the country was finally listening. The microphone on the witness stand squeaked as it adjusted, the sound breaking the hush that had settled thick and reverent over the courtroom. Walt didn't flinch. He stood slow, deliberate, as if rising from something far deeper than a chair. His hands rested at his sides, one thumb brushing over the crease of his coat out of habit. Not nerves. Judge Preston gave him a small nod. No pressure, no expectation, just space. Walt stepped forward, his boots scuffing softly against the polished floor. He looked out over the room, not above them, not past them, just into them. The way a man does when he's used to reading faces instead of filling silence. "I was told I could speak," he said, voice low but clear, carrying without force. "I don't have much to say." No one moved. He let the pause stretch, not for effect, but because that's how truth sometimes arrives. on its own time. "I've been called a lot of things," he went on. "Soldier, trainer, ghost, hero." He looked down at his boots, then up again. "But for the past few decades, I've mostly just been called nothing at all." A few in the back shifted. No one dared interrupt. "I didn't come here looking for pity," he said. "I don't need a statue. I don't need a headline. I don't even need a thank you." He let that hang. "What I came here looking for," he said, "was a place to be useful, simple, quiet, like a man offering a hand rather than asking for one. I served because that's what I was trained to do. Because when things fell apart, someone had to step forward, and I kept stepping forward until there wasn't anywhere left to stand." His eyes met the judge's, then drifted back to the rows of veterans and students and strangers who had gathered. "I've lived outside the system, slept on its edges, walked by people who saw right through me, but I never blamed them. That's the thing about being invisible. You learn to watch real close. And what I've seen is this: people still care. They've just forgotten how to show it." A young boy in the back, maybe 10, leaned into his father's shoulder. Walt noticed, and his voice softened. "I don't need a place to rest. I just need a place to work, to help, to give back, because that's where dignity lives, not in medals or documents, but in service." He stepped back from the microphone then, with no fanfare, no flourish, just a quiet return to his seat. And for a long, breathless moment, the entire courtroom forgot how to make noise, because they'd just witnessed something holy, a man, stripped of everything but purpose, still choosing to give. The gavel didn't strike that day. Judge Preston didn't need it. The courtroom was silent without being told, the way a room quiets when history decides to show up unannounced. She adjusted her glasses, not because she needed to, but because her hands had to do something. In front of her sat the file on Walter Mercer, no longer worn, no longer neglected. It had been copied, signed, submitted, and echoed all the way to the State House. She looked out over the courtroom, then at Walt, who sat with the calm of a man who had already accepted every possible outcome. No expectation, no fear, just patience. "This court," she began, voice steady but low, "has reviewed the full record of Sergeant Major Walter J. Mercer, including military documentation, legal transcripts, sealed reversals, and supporting testimony." A few pens stopped moving. Even the reporters knew not to interrupt. "The court acknowledges that Mr. Mercer's court-martial in 1994 was reversed by military review, and that the reversal was neither disclosed to him nor followed by any effort to restore his service status. This lapse constitutes a systemic failure of both justice and honor." Walt didn't move, but Eleanor thought she saw his jaw shift slightly, just enough to catch his breath. "It is the judgment of this court that Walter Mercer's record be formally cleared of any criminal designation. All references to dishonorable discharge shall be replaced with full honorable discharge status, retroactive to May 12, 1994. There was a pause, a rustle. Somewhere, someone's breath caught. "Furthermore," she continued, "this court recommends immediate reinstatement of all entitled veterans' benefits, including but not limited to pension, housing support, and full medical coverage under the Department of Veterans Affairs." She looked down for a beat, then back at him. "Mr. Mercer, you were owed more than this. You were owed better. But today, we begin the work of giving back what was taken." Walt gave a small nod. Not for show, just acknowledgement. One of the governor's aides stepped forward from the side bench, cleared his throat gently. "Your Honor," he said, voice careful, "the office of the governor has reviewed your findings. We've confirmed the Department of Defense will reissue all service honors to Mr. Mercer, including overdue recognition for his role in Operation Nightfall and various classified humanitarian deployments." He held up a letter, bearing the seal of the state and a second one from the DoD. The governor has also requested that Mr. Mercer be presented with the Distinguished Service Medal in a formal ceremony, date to be determined at his discretion. Walt blinked once, slowly. Preston leaned forward, softened her voice. You don't have to accept the ceremony if you'd rather not. He looked up, and for the first time since he'd entered her courtroom, he smiled, small but certain. I'll be there, he said, but only if they serve real coffee. The room exhaled all at once. It was done. But more than that, it was finally made right. The house on Elm Street had stood empty for years. Its porch sagged like tired shoulders, paint peeling in wide strips from the siding. Windows stared out blankly, weather-warped and sun-bleached, but it had good bones. That's what the contractor said when he ran his hand along the banister and smiled like he was touching something sacred. Judge Preston stood on the sidewalk, coat pulled tight against the wind, watching as volunteers pulled weeds from the yard and peeled off old wallpaper inside. Walt was there too, leaning on a rake, not supervising, just present, like always. He didn't say much, just nodded at the work, held nails when someone needed a third hand, and offered quiet advice that people somehow took like gospel. It had started small, an idea, a whisper in the hall after court adjourned. A few local veterans wanted to do something more than shake Walt's hand. A retired carpenter offered time. A roofer donated supplies. Then came the check from a former student of Walt's, a man he once trained who'd gone on to lead disaster relief units in 3 countries. Eleanor hadn't planned to be in charge of any of it, but somehow her name kept landing on the committee forms. She didn't object. She just showed up, sleeves rolled, clipboard in hand. The fundraiser had set a modest goal. They surpassed it in 48 hours. Walt didn't ask for it. In fact, when she told him about the plan, he had paused, eyes narrowed. A whole house, he said, skeptical. Seems like a lot for one man who's already had his turn. It's not a gift, Eleanor had replied. It's recognition, and maybe a beginning. He'd nodded slowly, but the next morning he handed her a list written in clean block letters, 6 names. All veterans, all living in shelters, cars, or worse. If there's space, he said, I'd rather not be the only one sleeping under a roof. So the house changed shape. The plans shifted, a 2nd bedroom, then a 3rd. Someone suggested bunk space in the attic. A local church donated furniture. The community college sent students to rewire the electrical system for credit. It was no longer a home. It was a mission. Walt never called it his house. He just called it the place on Elm, like it belonged to the street itself. When asked what he wanted in his own room, he shrugged. A good chair, somewhere to read, maybe a hook for my hat. He got the chair, leather, second-hand but clean. He got the hook too, right by the door. On move-in day, he hung his old cap on it, faded, sun-bleached, still bearing the emblem that no longer needed explaining. The porch stopped sagging. The house stood tall. And for the first time in a very long time, so did he. The name wasn't Walt's idea. He'd argued against it, quietly but firmly, when Judge Preston first mentioned it in a passing conversation over coffee. There are better names, he said. Names of folks who didn't come home. But the others insisted. Veterans, advocates, even law students from the nearby college who had started volunteering once they read about him. They all said the same thing. People needed a name they could believe in, one that came with weight, but no ego. So it became official, the Mercer Fund for Lost Veterans, a non-profit dedicated to offering legal advocacy, housing assistance, and recovery services for men and women who had slipped through the cracks like Walt had. People the system forgot. People who never asked for help because they didn't believe anyone would listen. The first office was small, 2 rooms above a hardware store, rent paid by donations and staffed by a team that ran on grit and donated coffee. They took their first case a week after opening. A vet in his 60s, dishonorably discharged over a technicality, denied benefits for nearly 2 decades. By the end of the month, he had a clean record and a set of keys to an apartment near the bus line. Walt showed up most mornings just after sunrise, hat in hand, always early. He never sat at the desk with the plaque that bore his name. He preferred the bench outside or the little break room table near the window. When people came in with nothing, he offered coffee. When they came in broken, he offered silence. He wasn't on payroll, wouldn't take a dime, said if they needed money, they should spend it on mattresses, not old soldiers. The others called him Mr. Mercer in official meetings. He told them to stop, said Walt was fine, said titles were like medals. They looked good, but didn't help much in a storm. He never gave speeches, never took the mic when the news showed up. At the first donor banquet, he stood at the back near the kitchen, listening while someone else told his story. When asked if he'd like to say a few words, he shook his head. They're already saying enough. But behind the scenes, he built things, quiet structures, a checklist for applying for discharge upgrades, a template for benefit appeals, a short guide for surviving shelter nights in winter. He kept a small notebook in his coat, filled with handwritten names and notes, and when someone came in off the street, quiet, weathered, unsure, he always looked up and nodded. "You're not lost," he'd say. "You just haven't been found yet." The Mercer Fund grew, but Walt stayed the same, always in the background, always just far enough from the light. But everyone knew the truth. He wasn't the symbol. He was the reason it all began. The bench was still there, just to the right of the courthouse steps. Same weathered wood, same iron legs worn smooth by time and passing shoes. It had been sanded down, re-stained, the bolts tightened, but they'd left the scuff on the third slat, the one Walt used to rest his hand on when he stood. 1 year had passed. The ceremony had been simple, like Walt insisted. No podium, no band. Just a few folding chairs, a small crowd, and a quiet moment under a cloudless sky. Judge Preston said a few words, brief and steady, then stepped aside as 2 veterans in dress uniform pulled the cloth from the new bronze plaque. It caught the morning light just enough to shine without bragging. "This bench once held a forgotten hero. May no one be overlooked again." There had been a pause after the cloth dropped. Not applause, just silence, the good kind. The kind that listens. Walt stood a few steps away during the unveiling, hands in his coat pockets, eyes on the ground. When the ceremony ended, he was the last to approach the plaque. He read it once, nodded, then walked away without a word. He passed by it every morning now, just after sunrise, on his way to the Mercer Fund office across town. He still didn't drive, said his feet knew where to go better than any engine. Each day, he'd stop for just a second, tip his cap, not to the plaque, but to the bench. Then he'd keep walking, coat flapping softly behind him, boots tracing a route that had become something like a ritual. Sometimes school kids sat on the bench, waiting for the bus. Sometimes a tired mother rested there between errands, or an older man with a half-eaten sandwich watched traffic go by. Walt never interrupted, never drew attention, just gave a slight nod and moved on. But those who sat long enough began to notice. Strangers started asking about the name on the plaque. Clerks told the story. Deputies pointed across the street and said, "That's him there." Teachers brought their students to see it, assigning essays about dignity and silence and service. And slowly, the bench became more than a bench. It became a promise. One morning, a new name appeared scribbled on a sticky note tucked beneath the plaque. Just a first name, no last, with the words, "Please help him too." Walt saw it, read it, folded it gently and slid it into his pocket before heading on his way. The system had once lost track of him, but now Walter Mercer was the reason it kept looking.